What if I told you that a race built up for months as the greatest 400-meter showdown in years ended in one of the most anticipated collapses track and field has seen in a decade? A 16, now 18-year-old phenom who was supposed to chase history. A college superstar who had just run the fourth fastest 400 meters ever recorded by a human being. An Olympic champion looking for one last moment of magic. All three lined up on the same track, in front of a crowd buzzing with the kind of energy usually reserved for world championship finals. And then, nothing happened. No records. No sub-44. No fireworks. Just silence where history was supposed to be written. Stick around, because by the end of this video you're going to understand exactly why the 400 meters is the single cruelest event in all of track and field, why almost nobody, not even Usain Bolt, has ever dared to master it, and why the night everyone expected to be legendary turned into one of the strangest anticlimaxes of the entire season. Before we get into it, if you're into deep dive breakdowns of track and field's biggest moments, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we're covering every major meet this season, and you do not want to miss what's coming next. Alright, let's get into the race that had the entire track world talking for weeks. Let's start with a number that sounds almost impossible once you actually sit with it. In the entire recorded history of the sport, only 32 men have ever run the 400 meters in under 44 seconds. 32. Ever. To put that in perspective, 232 men have broken 10 seconds in the 100 meters, according to World Athletics. That's already an exclusive club, but a big one compared to what we're talking about here. In the 200 meters, 130 men have gone under 20 seconds. So already you can see the pattern. As the distance grows, the club shrinks dramatically. But then you get to the 400, and the number doesn't just shrink, it falls off a cliff. 32 men. In the history of the sport, that is how rare a sub-44 400-meter run actually is. Think about how many elite sprinters have existed since electronic timing became standard. Think about every Olympics, every World Championship, every professional season for the last several decades. And out of all of that, only 32 men have ever crossed that particular threshold. Most seasons, across the entire globe, produce maybe one or two sub-44 performances, and they almost always happen on the very biggest stages: an Olympic final, a World Championship final, a marquee Diamond League meet. Seeing a 43 on the clock in a 400-meter race is one of the rarest sights in the entire sport. It's the kind of moment commentators lose their voice over. So why is the 400 meters such a brutal outlier? Why does it punish athletes in a way the 100 and 200 simply don't? The answer comes down to what the race actually demands from the human body. The 400 meters requires something almost contradictory. It wants raw top-end speed, the kind you need to fly through a 100 or 200-meter race. But it also wants the ability to survive a wall of fatigue and lactic acid buildup that hits hardest in the final 100 meters. Sprinters who look absolutely unbeatable over the shorter distances often completely fall apart in the last stretch of a 400 because their bodies simply were not built or trained to handle that specific kind of suffering. This is exactly why even the greatest sprinter who has ever lived, Usain Bolt, never seriously pursued a competitive 400-meter time. It wasn't a lack of talent. It's that the training required to become elite at 400 meters would have wrecked the explosive short sprint speed that made him the fastest human alive over 100 meters. The two disciplines pull an athlete's body in almost opposite directions. Mastering one often means sacrificing the other. That's part of why the 400 is sometimes called the most unforgiving event in the sport. It demands a level of physical and mental toughness that very few athletes on Earth actually possess. So when a loaded field of Olympic champions, national record holders, and a teenage phenom lined up for the men's 400 meters at the Ed Murphey Classic in Memphis, the excitement wasn't just about watching a fast race. Fans genuinely believed they were about to watch history happen in real time. Let's talk about the athletes who made this race feel so massive, starting with the name that had been building buzz for years, Quincy Wilson. At just 16 years old, Wilson qualified for the 2024 Olympic team as part of the 4x400 relay pool. He didn't even get to run in the final. He only competed in the heats, but Team USA went on to win gold anyway. That single detail made Wilson the youngest American male track and field Olympian in history, and by extension, an Olympic gold medalist before he was even old enough to vote. Just sit with that for a second. Most 16-year-olds are worrying about a driver's permit. Wilson was standing on an Olympic podium. That same year, Wilson set the world under 18 best in the 400 meters, running a stunning 44.20 in Florida. That alone would have been enough to make him a story for years. But a year later, at this exact same meet, the Ed Murphey Classic, he lowered that mark even further, running 44.10 to beat a stacked professional field that included a former Olympic champion. Let that sink in. An active teenager beating grown, professional, Olympic-caliber athletes. That performance made Wilson the second fastest under 20 athlete in history, trailing only one man, Steve Lewis, who ran an almost mythical 43.87 to win Olympic gold as a 19-year-old, all the way back in 1988. Nearly 40 years later, that record still hasn't fallen. Wilson's path to this level started early. He began running track at just 8 years old, and by the time he reached high school at Bullis School in Maryland, he was already breaking national records. His presence on a starting line became so intimidating that other high schoolers reportedly looked beaten before the gun even fired. That's the kind of aura that gets built over years of dominance, not overnight. He carried that dominance across 2 straight seasons of record-breaking runs, 44.20 in 2024, then 44.10 in 2025, both of them, interestingly, set right here in Memphis at this same meet. Wilson wrapped up his high school career this past spring, and for most of it, he looked completely unbeatable. But his final high school race in the Open 400 didn't go the way the script demanded. At the U.S. Under-20 Championships, Wilson ran 44.84, a genuinely excellent time for an 18-year-old, but he finished second, behind a rising talent named Jaden Dion, who won the race in 44.52. For a runner who had barely tasted defeat throughout his entire high school career, that loss stung. And a lot of fans and analysts expected exactly that kind of sting to fuel something big heading into Memphis. Nothing motivates a dominant athlete quite like a rare loss. Ogazi is a 20-year-old Nigerian sprinter who capped off an enormous collegiate season at the University of Alabama by winning back-to-back NCAA titles in the 400 meters. At this year's NCAA championships in Eugene, Oregon, Ogazi exploded to a time of 43.38, absolutely shattering Michael Norman's collegiate record of 43.61, a mark that had stood since 2018. Think about that for a second. Michael Norman is one of the most talented 400-meter runners this century has produced, and his collegiate record stood for the better part of a decade before Ogazi tore through it. That run didn't just make Ogazi a college legend. It moved him to 4th on the all-time world list, behind only 3 names. World record holder Wade Van Niekerk at 43.03, the legendary Michael Johnson at 43.18, and Butch Reynolds at 43.29. To put Ogazi's time in real-world context, his 43.38 would have actually won the 2024 Olympic final in Paris, where Quincy Hall took gold in 43.40. A college athlete running a time that would have beaten the reigning Olympic champion. That's the kind of stat that stops conversations in their tracks. Ogazi didn't just stumble into that time either. He built toward it methodically across the season, running 44.02, then 43.95, then 43.82, steadily chipping away before finally breaking through with the 43.38 at Nationals. That's the profile of an athlete peaking at exactly the right moment. And his rise didn't stop with American record books. That same run in Eugene also broke Nigeria's national record, a mark that had stood for close to 30 years, and pushed him to 6th on the all-time African list. For a country with such a proud sprinting tradition, that made Ogazi a genuine national story back home, not just a college standout in America, but a symbol of something bigger for Nigerian athletics. The Ed Murphey Classic carried extra weight for Ogazi too, because it marked his very first race as a professional. Stepping straight out of college glory and into a stacked international field that included an Olympic champion and one of the most talked-about teenagers in the sport. That's about as intense a professional debut as you could possibly script. But Wilson and Ogazi were far from the only storylines in this race. Grenada's Kirani James, the 2012 Olympic champion, lined up looking for one more big performance late in his career. Even in his 30s, James remains a dangerous closer, the kind of veteran who can hurt you in the final 50 meters if you're not careful. His experience made him a genuine wildcard against a field full of much younger legs. Jamaica's Antonio Watson and American Randolph Ross also entered in strong form, rounding out what became one of the deepest 400-meter lineups of the entire 2026 season. There was even a subplot happening back at the NCAA championships that added extra fuel to the fire heading into Memphis. Georgia freshman Jonathan Sims finished second behind Ogazi with a personal best of 43.92, becoming just the second man in history to break 44 seconds as a junior-aged athlete, joining Steve Lewis all the way back in 1988. His Georgia teammate rounded out an all-Georgia podium in third place with a 44.20. Sims wasn't entered in the Memphis field, but his rise added to a growing feeling across the sport that 2026 was shaping up to be one of the fastest 400-meter seasons ever run. With that much collective talent on one starting line, expectations heading into Memphis were sky-high. Fans pointed to the warm, humid conditions, a notoriously fast track, and Wilson's well-documented track record of running his best times late in the summer season. This was, after all, the exact same meet where he had run 44.10 the year before. Plenty of people expected another personal best from the 18-year-old, maybe even his first run under the sacred 44-second barrier. Ogazi, meanwhile, was the clear betting favorite given his collegiate record, and plenty of people wondered whether the jump into professional racing could actually push him even faster than his already blistering 43.38. Add in a two-time Olympic medalist in Kirani James and a hungry, motivated Randolph Ross, and this had every ingredient of a race capable of shaking up the entire season, or maybe even threatening history itself. Online forums and running message boards buzzed for days leading into the meet, with fans debating who would break 44 first and whether this could finally be the night a teenager did the unthinkable. Samuel Ogazi did win the men's 400 at the Ed Murphey Classic, but in a far more modest time than anyone expected. He crossed the line in 44.57, more than a full second slower than his NCAA record performance just weeks earlier. Antonio Watson took second in 44.70, and Kirani James rounded out the podium in 45.04. Solid times, sure, respectable by almost any normal standard, but nowhere near the fireworks fans had spent weeks hyping themselves up for. And as for Quincy Wilson, the night simply didn't go as planned. He finished 7th in 45.53, well off his personal best of 44.10, and nowhere close to the sub-44 barrier so many people expected him to chase down. Randolph Ross finished 6th in 45.48. Gabriel Maranta placed 4th in 45.22, and Delano Kennedy closed out the field in 45.82. There was no world record. There was no sub-44 performance from anyone in the entire field. After months of build-up surrounding two of the most talked-about 400-meter runners on the planet, the most hyped showdown of the summer turned into one of the more forgettable races of the entire season. Now that you understand what happened in Memphis, it's worth stepping back and looking at just how unusual this event has always been. Because the story of the 400 meters is really the story of a handful of athletes who managed to do something almost nobody else in human history has done. The current world record belongs to Wade van Niekerk of South Africa, who ran an astonishing 43.03 at the 2016 Rio Olympics, breaking a record that had stood since 1999 when Michael Johnson ran 43.18 at the Seville World Championships. Johnson's time was considered untouchable for so long that many assumed it might never fall. It took 17 years and a runner in an unusual lane draw. Van Niekerk ran from lane 8 in Rio, meaning he couldn't see any of his competitors ahead of him, to finally break it. Before Johnson, the record belonged to Butch Reynolds, who ran 43.29 in 1988, a time that itself stood for over a decade before Johnson topped it. Reynolds' record came during an era when American sprinters largely dominated the 400 meters on the world stage, a tradition that runners like Quincy Hall and Michael Norman have carried into the present day. Steve Lewis, the name that keeps coming up throughout Wilson's story, deserves his own spotlight here. Back in 1988, at just 19 years old, Lewis won Olympic gold in Seoul with a time of 43.87, a run that made him, for decades, the standard against which every young 400-meter talent would be measured. The fact that Quincy Wilson is now the second fastest under 20 athlete in history, sitting only behind a record that has survived since before Wilson's own parents were likely born, tells you everything about how difficult that mark has been to approach, let alone break. It's also worth remembering just how small this club of elite sub-44 runners really is when you place it next to the sport's other glamour events. Usain Bolt's world record of 9.58 seconds in the 100 meters is one of the most famous numbers in all of sports, and yet, as mentioned earlier, 232 men have gone under 10 seconds in that event. The 200 meters has 130 men under the 20-second mark, but the 400 meters, arguably requiring the most complete athletic profile of any sprint event, has led only 32 men into its most exclusive club. That imbalance says a lot about why so many fans treat any serious sub-44 attempt as appointment viewing. Michael Johnson's dominance throughout the 1990s remains one of the most complete eras in 400-meter history. He didn't just hold the world record for nearly 2 decades. He built an aura around the event that turned every major final he entered into a coronation. His famous golden spikes at the 1996 Atlanta Olympics, where he won both the 200 and 400 meters, remain one of the most iconic images in Olympic track and field history. More recently, the American 400-meter program has experienced a genuine resurgence. Quincy Hall's gold medal run of 43.40 at the 2024 Paris Olympics re-established American dominance in the event on the biggest stage possible, and it's part of why Samuel Ogazi's 43.38 at NCAA's turned so many heads. A college athlete, still just 20 years old, running a time that would have beaten an Olympic champion just months earlier. And that brings the story full circle back to Memphis. On paper, the Ed Murphey Classic had every ingredient of a historic night. A teenager with Olympic gold already in his pocket, a collegiate record breaker stepping into his first professional race, and an Olympic champion in Kirani James looking for one final signature performance. It's exactly the kind of setup that, in a sport with such a small margin between legendary and forgettable, could have gone either way. That, in the end, might be the most important lesson from this whole story. The 400 meters doesn't care about hype, buzz, or how many people are debating your race on a forum 3 days beforehand. It rewards preparation, timing, and an almost impossible balance between speed and pain tolerance, and it punishes anyone who isn't perfectly in sync with that balance on race day, no matter how talented they are. Ogazi still won. Wilson is still just 18 years old with what looks like a long career ahead of him. But on this particular night, in this particular race, the 400 meters reminded everyone watching exactly why only 32 men in history have ever beaten it under 44 seconds. If you enjoyed this deep dive, let us know in the comments who you think breaks 44 seconds first, Wilson or Ogazi. And don't forget to subscribe for more track and field breakdowns like this one.